Well, welcome tonight. Some of you have probably heard my talk on the origins of Silicon Valley. Well, that kind of led into this one. So tonight we're going to talk about these early years. I'm going to go over the very early years before any of us were around and talk about the people, the companies, the culture. And then we're going to go into the war years, and Norm and I will talk about klystrons and magnetrons and why they were so important. Then the post-war years, the use of high-frequency microwave tubes. And then finally, the 50s and 60s. We'll bring in Ted to talk about what happened as transistors and ICs were invented and took root here, what the local products were, what happened at Intel, and then we'll open it up for questions. So at the end, if you have a question, there's sheets around. So as you think about it, write it down and pass it off to Brian or Alan or somebody. He'll bring it up here. And we'll select some of those questions for our final maybe 15-minute question and answer wrap up with our guests on the panel. So a quick look. Originally this was the Valley of Heart's Delight. And so it was all orchards, as I think Ted's going to mention later. But we're going to go back to about 1909 with the founding of Federal Telegraph in Palo Alto. It was an offspring of Stanford. Lee DeForest, who all of you electrical engineers remember as the inventor of the vacuum tube, or at least the Audion, the triode and so on, came out here for a few years and worked at Federal Telegraph to develop new circuits, new devices. Well, ham radio was really big in the Bay Area, and I think I ascribe the fact that ham radio was sort of the culture here to how Silicon Valley got started, why it's here in the first place. But there were a lot of electronic firms, Remler, Magnavox, those names sort of ring a bell with us. Heinz and Kaufman was a company that made tubes and radios. I mentioned Federal Telegraph. They produced transmitters, installed a lot of them in Europe, up to a 1,000,000-watt transmitters. So it's very a big business here in the Bay Area in that. As a result, there were lots of parts available, lots of radio parts. If you wanted to build something around here, somebody probably had the parts for it, and you could maybe buy them at a local store, at Zach's or someplace like that. And it was a great place for radio amateurs because they could get the pieces they needed from friends who worked in the business. There were also a lot of jobs for people who knew something about communication. Remember, this was not a course in college in those early days. So this was still sort of being invented here in the 10s and 20s of the 20th century. Well, there were a number of defining events in those times. First of all, there was a lot of wealth around here, left over from the days of the gold rush. So a lot of finance went on here, also a lot of trade across the Pacific. And so the Titanic sinking in 1912 was a milestone in a sense, because that and World War I made it really obvious that communications were going to be a key to the modern era of naval projection of naval forces, communication between ships and shore, and that sort of thing. So after the war, there was a great realization that technology was going to be really critical. So the U.S. Navy pushed for a lot more development in this area. A lot of money flowed in. The commercial companies like AT&T, the telephone company, would like to replace telegraph lines and undersea cables with this wireless stuff if it worked out. Well, this brought a lot of activity here and a lot of funding and a lot of innovation. I'm going to describe to you a few of the individuals just barely so you get a feel for who they were and what was happening here. William Eitel went to Los Gatos High School. That's just, a few miles from here. And during the term and also during the summer, he'd work at his father's quarry up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So he learned a lot about how to maintain machinery, crushers and graders, things like this. But he also had an uncle up in Oakland who had the Hall Scott Motor Company. And so he would work up there in the summer for several months, working on machinery that was used to make automobiles. And during World War I, airplane engines. They built the Liberty engine there in Oakland. And so he had quite a good experience, even coming out of high school, with mechanical arts. Jack McCullough and Charles Litton are two other people I'd like to mention. They attended the California School of Mechanical Arts. Now it's the Lick High School in San Francisco, but it was founded to give a solid high school technical education to California's children, boys and girls, to give them training in the mechanical trades because there was such a need for them around here. They're a good job market for those people. And Litton said at one time, he says, I got a realistic feel for materials and processes during my high school years at the Lick Wilmerding High School. Well, Jack McCullough and Charles Litton went on after high school. McCullough went to local junior college, and Litton went to Stanford in mechanical engineering, because in those days, electrical engineering was electrical power transmission, no communications really to speak of. And they had a small department, just a few instructors. He got his bachelor's degree in 1924 in mechanical engineering. And at that point, they introduced a course in communications technology. Very interesting, communications engineering. So he took that. It was the first set of courses on communications, and he thought that was quite exciting. Well, all of these boys at the time were introduced to amateur radio, which we call ham radio, through their families and friends. In ham radio, if you know somebody who's got one in their garage, they're always happy to show it off to their friends and show how they can talk to Southern California or Nebraska or something like that. So it's a very collegial atmosphere. So they became acquainted with technology and building circuits. There weren't commercial radios that you could buy, so you built your own circuits for receiving and then for transmitting using power tubes. And the ham radio in the Bay Area in those days was pretty isolated. There was the big stuff on the East Coast in New Jersey, New York, a lot around Chicago and Detroit, and then there was the wasteland of the West. And so we were out here sort of isolated, but we had a great maritime orientation here because we had a major seaport. We had several large steamship company lines running stuff to Hawaii, to the Far East, all around the Pacific. There were also several military bases supporting the Navy presence. And so there were a lot of companies that needed people to work for them. Ham radio operators were great for running their radios on ships, so they got lots of jobs. At that point in time, in the early 20s, there were 1,200 amateur operators in the Bay Area, which was 10% of the U.S. population of radio operators, which makes no sense at all. There was clearly a bubble here and something was happening. Well, the ham radio subculture is a little different. How many of you are ham radio operators? So I see, wow, okay, about half of you are. So you know all about this. It's a very a collegial group. There's a lot of sociability among hams. It's a way to make friends. You can talk to them over the air, kind of like having friends on Facebook today, I think. But also there were a lot of face-to-face meetings because they got together in ham fests. They traded parts. They traded circuits. They talked about, hey, I did this like this. Try this, it's going to work better. I just talked to Hawaii, and here's how I did it. So there's a lot of that. It was very egalitarian. It was very little distinction based on class. And when Eitel was head of the Santa Clara County Radio Club, he said they had farm boys and Stanford students and Federal Telegraph technicians and retired executives all working together in this one hobby. It was kind of a fun thing for them to do together. It was exciting. You kept pushing the state of the art. You got your reputation by how you could do something a little better than somebody else. So there was competition, but then you wanted to show them how to do it. Kind of like Steve Wozniak wanted to give away his Apple I design. He says, yeah, sure, here's the design for it. I think Steve Jobs stopped that. Anyway,